So now it's time to start the first the News Impact Summit Democratizing Data of the year. And I cannot be more proud and excited as a Galician to introduce another Galician to open Democratizing Data. Welcome, Xaquín González Veira, co-founder of Visualization for Transparency Foundation. Xaquín is an expert in Dataviz, visual explanations, and interactive storytelling. And he will take us today on a journey in which he will show us the best examples of innovative data visualization from the past year. Bienvenido, Xaquín.
Muchas gracias, Angela. If you can show my presentation. About a year and 1 day ago, exactly, as part of my obsession with COVID dashboards and open data efforts, I saw this story popping off my news feed. And like, wow, on the one hand, the good side, I was like, that's quite a commitment to transparency. And on the other hand, the bad one, I was like, wow, that's quite a commitment to opacity from the Florida government. Then this happened.
The Florida scientist whose home was raided last week says she will continue to speak truth to power. She's been challenging her state's coronavirus response, particularly the data they put out concerning deaths. And now the South Florida newspaper Sun Sentinel is questioning some of those states' numbers too. Victor Oquendo has more from Miami.
Showdown in Florida after newly released body cam video shows the moment police raided the home of former Florida data scientist Rebecca Jones.
Take a step back. Get to the door. Now. Open the door, ma'am.
Stop grabbing the doorknob.
Open it now. Come outside. Who else is in the house, ma'am?
My 2 children and my husband.
Where's your husband now? Calm down. Calm down.
You want the children now?
Police, come down now.
Do not point that gun at my children.
Search warrant. Come down the stairs, sir.
Pointing a gun at the stairs. There are children up there.
A camera inside Jones's home shows police with guns.
I mean, right? That's, is this worth the risk, our commitment to transparency and to democratizing data? Then I remember this one. About a week before authorities imposed a lockdown in Spain, the National Security Department was informing of COVID-19 cases with this map. And I'll let you read the numbers and see the sizes, check the sizes of the bubbles. And Twitter, being the platform of know-it-alls that it is, I mean, they had this coming, right? But then, in the context of what we just saw happening, what was he thinking? I mean, reworking a visual to accurately depict the extent of the pandemic, right? That's dangerous. Thank goodness Spain ain't Florida, right? And I think if there is something that defined data visualization during COVID was the visual and data literacy efforts that we saw from the data communication community, the news apps desk, the visual desks, the data journalism teams. We didn't sleep and held public Dataviz to the same standard that we impose on ourselves. One of my favorite examples, because it's just so odd to understand, is this dashboard from the State Health Authority in Georgia in the United States. And if you read the text carefully, let me make it bigger here. If you read the text carefully, and I wish I could pull off a Southern accent to do so. The chart says, the title of the chart says, the chart below represents the most impacted counties over the past 15 years and the number of cases over time. Right. So look at the graphic. See the dates. See the sorting of each of the blocks of bars. I mean, it feels as if someone had just shuffled the bars to make it impossible to decode. And in reality, it shows which its order from the worst day to the least worrisome, and it shows it's ordered by which county was the most affected that day. But I mean, there are many ways of solving this, but you could have grouped them by country, and keep time in the x-axis and have 5 blocks of bar charts like this one. So you could see that, for example, in this case, cases are going down now in Fulton. And it isn't just the visual representation of itself what we were concerned about in those sleepless nights. In Spain, the always alert Daniele Grasso from El País tweeted this 6 months ago. I'll translate for my non-Spanish speaking friends. It says that every day the health ministry publishes in their report a table where it compares the incidence in Spain with that of other countries. It would be a great context if it weren't for a little trick they're playing on us. They were basically comparing apples and oranges. The number from Spain came from a completely different data set, updated to a different moment than the data set that fed the rest of the numbers from every other country. It was, and if you look at the alternative reality, it's kind of like a fringe moment. If you look at the alternative reality and the real reality, Spain and Germany were actually much closer than the picture that was being painted by the official statistics. El País, where Daniel works, had perfect timing to invest in a data and visuals team. It showed that they had been, it showed really, and they had been doing incredible work tracking the pandemic globally and nationally, adding context and explaining data nuances, which actually contribute to data literacy of their readers. And that's that defining shift that the coverage of the ongoing pandemic has brought. More people now understand why we visualize a phenomenon that grows exponentially using a logarithmic scale and what that highlights. We're brave enough to put words like this as the subhead of a graphic for a general audience. And log scales have become truly commonplace to understand this. We explained the readers the meaning behind bending the curve, and it became a recurring phrase. We explained it as in this graphic by the scroll time graphic by the New York Times. We explained readers the meaning behind that phrase, and it became a recurring phrase to refer to the efforts to beat the pandemic. I mean, a visualization became the way we understood the solution to that phenomenon I mean, pinch me, please. I mean, I thought I was tripping when I saw like this becoming such a well-known and understood phrase, such a visual phrase. In Spain, the government even had an interactive dashboard that visualized the extent of the pandemic. I mean, we're talking, this is insane. There's an interactive dashboard to inform the public, except for this. And it brings us to what I sort of hinted before, is that public administrations were not ready. And open data considerations were still not a priority for public administrations. This is when the state of alarm and lockdown happened in Spain, and this is when this website launched. And this is a tool that is supposed to help businesses make strategic decisions and citizens understand the severity of the pandemic. And yet it was launched that late, 2 months after. And I mean, it takes time, obviously, but you could play out efforts in a sequential manner. I remember that over a weekend, a group of researchers at the University of Girona, where I teach, over a weekend, we put together this data dashboard showing the confirmed cases, the deaths, and the evolution of the pandemic, and it was managed automatically from a data feed, and we saw that there's potential to do this kinds of trackers. If you follow, I don't know if this audience, the ones into data visualization and into visual coding, positive, they know this website, Observable HQ, but the tremendous effort by the research and computer science community to sort of visualize and explain and show trackers was immense. If you search for coronavirus in here, you've got like now hundreds upon hundreds of notebooks with the code, the methodology, and how they visualize this. It's a great resource, and you can find absolutely tremendous, innovative visualization displays of the COVID data in here. And okay, that happened almost a year ago, or over a year ago, I'm sorry. And you're like, okay, we've been like training at this for a year. We know what's next. We know that after this, the pandemic, there's the vaccination rollout issues. We're thinking we're ready now. We already know what we have to do in terms of data, in terms of data communication and visualization, right? We do. We know what we need to do, right? That there reads spreadsheet file with open data. That's the extent of the effort. I mean, please, like the Spaniards in the room who are saying like, well, at least it's not on a PDF. Don't do that, please. Don't do that. Don't encourage bad behavior. If we if we think that this is enough, we're encouraging bad behavior from the public administrations. This is not enough. They need to be doing a lot more than this. And at the Visualization for Transparency Foundation, we took this data and we automated we put it on GitHub. We shared with the world, and we created this automated tracker that actually showed whether or not the regions in Spain were on track, to what it was thought to be the pace of the vaccine rollout. We create, again, very little resources, and I understand our mandate and our procurement process and our rhythms are not the ones of the public administration, but still we were able to do this in about a week. So at the end of this, we've understood that at the end of this year, I think everyone has understood that visualization can transform how accessible open data can be, and can truly revolutionize like accountability and open data and transparency. But we've only scratched the surface. We're fighting so much to have something that allows us to proper tracking of the pandemic, that we forget that this pandemic affected people. And these types of visualizations are what we should do more of. We can't forget, even though it's an abstracted view, there's still the connection for the readers that each one of these dots is a person. You lose that when we lose that in the squiggly lines of the logarithmic charts or of the bar charts. In here, it's much easier for readers to understand that one of those little dots is a person that is sick or has died, and it helps to every once in a while remember that in all this effort to democratize data, not only exposing the numbers is key, but it's also link them back to the person they are about.
Thank you very much for opening the first News Impact Summit of the year. Xaquín will be leaving now, but he will come back to moderate the Ask Me Anything session later on. And so hold your questions for there, and you will be able to address them there. So we would like you to see on this virtual stage, Niko Kommenda, Visuals Project Editor of The Guardian, and edits interactive stories. He knows his stuff. Niko is particularly passionate about covering the environment, health, and transport beats. Niko also likes sports, music, and everything related to maps. Today, he will highlight some of The Guardian's most ambitious visual projects from 2020, and he will discuss how readers' understanding of the data has changed since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Niko, welcome to Democratizing Data.
Thanks for the lovely introduction, Lars. Let me share my screen and slides with you all. Great, okay. So you've just given a lovely introduction of who I am. I'm one of the project editors at The Guardian on the visuals team, so that there are many of us. And I coordinate with other desks across the newsroom to find the most interesting stories that can do with interactive or visual treatments. For this talk today, I've split my time into kind of two fairly separate parts. The first part will be about some of my favorite projects from the past year and a half since the start of the pandemic. They're all linked to COVID in some form, but I won't be talking about the Guardian's case trackers or death trackers or anything like that. I'll be talking about one-off stories that deal with how the UK government addressed the pandemic and some of the social and environmental side effects of COVID-19. For the second part of the talk, I want to go back to something that Xaquín was just talking about, my impression of how readers' data literacy and graphics literacy has changed in 2020. I think that's a really interesting topic. So let's start with some of my favorite projects from last year. The very first one was titled How 3/4 of COVID contacts Slip Through the Cracks. And this means the cracks of England's test and trace system. This is a very expensive system that got a lot of criticism in the media because it wasn't performing well. And a lot of people who caught COVID or came into contact with infected people never knew about it and ended up catching the virus themselves. How did we present this story? I came up with this flow graphic, which kind of has a similar visual metaphor to the project Xaquín was highlighting earlier. One dot is one person. And in the story, they go through the test and trace process, and you can see how at every single stage of that system, some people are not really recognized by the system and drop out. So some people have the virus, but they never get tested because testing capacity in the UK was quite low in the initial months of the pandemic. Some people get tested, and then they're supposed to get a call from the test and trace call centers, but somehow they aren't reached. So they don't pick up the phone, or somehow no contact details are available for them. And so as we go through the system, more and more people kind of drop out, right? And what did we want to achieve with this visual representation? What were the key aims of this story? We wanted to explain the test and trace system step by step, because unless you have the virus yourself or one of your close friends has had it, you probably don't really know what the process is, how it works. More importantly, we wanted to highlight the system's really poor overall performance, even if every stage on its own seems okay. So for example, 85% of all people in England who get a positive COVID test are reached by contact tracers on the phone. That means they pick up the phone and they're told you have to isolate at home now, right? And 85% doesn't sound that bad. But if you have a similar amount of dropouts at every stage, 15% who aren't reached, overall, the system is extremely leaky, and a large number of people who are at risk are never contacted. And this leads me to the last point, how to visualize that, how to show that in a kind of interesting visual way. That's where this visualization of the individual dots fanning out to the sides comes in. And this was a really interesting challenge for me personally, right? To design this graphic in a way that they kind of spread into the copy here on the right-hand side and away from the main stream. So that was one of my favorite projects. That was end of last year. The second project I want to highlight was about COVID key workers or frontline workers not being able to afford buying a house in Great Britain. And this is a story that I think is really important socially, because throughout the pandemic, we heard a lot about how valued these workers are, and people have been clapping for medical workers, and people have been kind of, in our heads, we know that these people are really important to our system. But in terms of what they actually earn and how they live, they aren't actually valued as much. And this is where this story comes in. So we picked 5, we think, representative professions who are all key workers. So teachers, nurses, bus drivers, postmen, and then care workers. And the project showed where these people, on average, let's say, could afford to buy their own house. And what I really enjoyed about working on this project was that we took a lot of sometimes fairly complex assumptions and came up with this really simple representation in the end. So buying a house is very complex. You need to know about the distribution of house prices in each area. You need to know a bit about the distribution of salaries, and then getting a mortgage. So getting the money from the bank depends on a lot of other factors, like how old you are, whether you have other debts like a student loan, and all kinds of things like that. So we wanted to take all these really complex factors and distill them into the simplest possible view. And this is what we came up with: a map that just says, red, you probably can't afford to live here. Green, you might be able to afford to live here. So that was another one of my favorite projects, and that was launched earlier this year, so a bit later on in the pandemic. What I just talked about, one of the challenges was picking representative examples of professions and getting away from the nitty-gritty and small details. You can still get this information in the story. It's mentioned in the copy, and there is a big long note at the end that explains exactly where we got our data from. But for this graphic, we wanted the view to be really simple and powerful. And finally, I wanted to highlight 2 other projects briefly. As Lars mentioned, I like working on environment stories. And obviously, the pandemic has impacted all kinds of other areas, not just the health system itself, but things like the environment. And I wanted to showcase 2 stories there. One was from March last year on how pollution levels in China and other countries dropped dramatically for a while. And one interesting thing to note about this project maybe is, again, I've tried to abstract away some of the technical details. You will notice the color scale on this graphic just says less NO2 or more NO2. NO2 is one type of pollutant that's kind of harmful to people. And you could give a lot more detail on what the numbers actually are, but my thinking was this wouldn't actually help the average person get the story more. I thought the simpler the better. You can see how pollution was way higher last year. So this is what I came up with. And similarly, I had a story shortly after on how air traffic has changed after the pandemic started. And I just thought this was a really interesting visual. At a glance, you can get so many interesting details, like places like the US not really seeing a reduction in traffic at all, while others completely collapse. So very interesting project to work on. Right, that brings me to the second part of the presentation. What has happened in 2020 more widely with readers' data literacy and understanding of graphics? We sometimes call that graphicacy, fancy little word. My hypothesis is that 2020 has massively increased people's understanding of numbers, data, and charts. Right? I mean, I think Xaquín was mentioning earlier, the fact that flatten the curve, this kind of visual idiom, became one of the key mottos of the pandemic early on, has been huge for our profession, for visual journalists, for data journalists. And people immediately got this idea that they will have to understand the graphics and the numbers if they want to be able to follow the news this year, essentially. Right, so what are some concrete examples of new graphics that we've seen? I think one of the main changes has been, as basic as it sounds, that people now understand rates as opposed to absolute numbers. So early on in the pandemic, this was an example of a COVID-19 map by The Sun. And this was just using absolute numbers. And the areas that were darkest in this map have the highest absolute numbers of cases. But if we think for a second, that obviously isn't a very meaningful view of data, because a lot more people live in London and the southeast of England than, for example, in Wales. So Wales looks like it's doing okay on this map. It's not, you know, in a super dark color. But actually, if we did adjust for population, this would look quite differently. But I think we've come a long way since then. And here is a more positive example I found from recently. I think a very clean map by the BBC. So this does adjust for the population. So we're getting the case rate per 100,000. And the color scale, I think, is beautiful. It's very well chosen. And you immediately get a sense of where the hotspots are relative to the population, rather than, you know, just where people live. Another big change for me, who's worked in visual journalism for a few years now, is that people are starting to understand rolling averages, right? Coming from an environment background, doing a few stories on environment, I always had the feeling that some people didn't really understand what a rolling average was. And in environment and climate change specifically, I think some people were actively skeptical of rolling averages. People saw that and they were thinking, well, why are you doing this to the data? Are you trying to make it say something that it wouldn't otherwise say? So some people were skeptical, some people didn't really get it. And I think that's completely changed since COVID-19. So here we have an example from the UK government's COVID dashboard. Millions of people will have seen this page. And it's kind of obvious why we need a rolling average here. This is a chart of deaths by date reported. And basically every weekend, the number of reported deaths drops. And then on the Monday and Tuesday of the week after, the numbers kind of catch up, literally as doctors and coroners go back into the office and finish writing the reports. So if you didn't have this rolling average here, it would be extremely hard to tell where the trend is going, right? And we can see quite clearly why it is a helpful smoothing factor here. And finally, I think it's not just the readers who have really upped their game in terms of understanding graphics. It's also that journalists are finding really clever ways of building complex graphics that are still clear and accessible for a broad audience. There's a beautiful example from John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times, and it shows case rates and hospital admissions in Israel after the start of the vaccination rollout earlier this year. And this is not a simple graphic by any means. The two time series are indexed to a certain peak here, so we don't get, so the units are just 0 to 100%. We have some other things marked on here: vaccine rollout begins, lockdown begins, and so on. But your eyes are immediately drawn to the one place where, you know, the action is happening, which is the vaccine effect, this green shaded area. And you can immediately see the people, all the people who got their vaccines first are now doing better on both metrics. And this is what John terms the vaccine effect, and this is what he wants us to look at. And so this fairly complex graphic is suddenly quite accessible, I would say, even to someone who isn't normally that engaged with news graphics or data journalism. So I thought this was a beautiful example. And then finally, I do think we are still in a very fast-paced environment, maybe faster than ever, more stressful than ever. So small mistakes do happen. And the next example is one example of that, but I obviously don't want to blame any individuals or make this look ridiculous in any way. This is a map that the BBC published earlier this year on the vaccine rollout globally. And I do think it has some of the classic problems of quick visual journalism, where maybe someone just asked for a map without really thinking what the pros and cons would be. So at this stage in the rollout, the two countries that were furthest ahead were Israel and the UAE. And you basically can't see either of them because they happen to be geographically very, very small countries. What I can see on this map is a lot of no data. I can see Russia, Brazil, the US and Canada, but it's really not what the story should be about, I think. So arguably, this could have been done a lot better. Maybe it didn't need to be a map in the first place. So yes, mistakes still happen in visual journalism, but I think we have made some really, really big steps over the past year and a half. And that's me. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to the Q&A section.
Thanks, Niko. Thank you so much for this great presentation. We'll be talking more in detail with you, Xaquín and Ada later. But first, we have to bring Ada to the stage. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to the great Adriana Homolova. Ada is a Slovak-born, Netherlands-based data journalist. Ada specializes in the collection and making sense of what she said, very large Excel tables. Since 2020, Ada has been involved as data specialist in various cross-border projects at the OCCRP, Arena Journalism in Europe, Lost in Europe. Ada is sharing with us today the outcome of her data investigative project, Europe Spending, Spread and Mask. Ada, where does European national public spending go? Tell us.
Hello, Angela. Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Lovely. So I will share you with you my presentation. Thank you for the kind introduction, Angela. Please, if you hear strange noises, that might be fighter jets flying over me. So don't be alarmed. That can happen. But if there's any problem in the connection, please let me know. As Angela said, my name is Adriana Homolova. I am a freelance data journalist and a data skills trainer. I've been involved in many cross-border reports, investigative. With Lost in Europe. I am working on a data harvest conference as a data skills trainer, and I also recently published, for example, with a collective of investigative journalists, a report into institutional landlords in Europe. So that's me. But I'm here to talk about a project that I did in 2020, which is Europe COVID-19 Spending Spree Unmasked. This I have done with the OCCRP. For those who are not familiar with the OCCRP, is the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. They do a fabulous job on reporting on organized crime and corruption in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and basically all over the place. And as you can see there on the left lower part of the screen, they also publish about coronavirus, crime, corruption, and coronavirus. I think they have very good a knack for alliterations. And yeah, how did we democratize data in this publication? So I have divided. Apologies. Through this presentation, I'll tell you what the story was about, so don't worry about that, but you can also read it. I'll share the link later. So what we basically did is that we collected data on public procurement during the COVID pandemics, where, as you might know, we called it panic pandemic buying. It was, everybody wanted masks, everybody wanted ventilators. It was a hot mess. Nobody had anything. Companies who were any companies who had any contact with China suddenly, got into dealing masks. It was crazy. So what we did in this project is that we have collected data on all of the spending from 30 countries in Europe, and this is how we published about it. So first way how we democratized data about this public spending was that we gave the context. So this is the introduction to the article. It says there was one early and obvious casualty, which was transparency. So what we found out is that billions of euros were actually spent without ever being reported about. So in this map, this is the first map that we showed in the article. We showed that there were a couple of countries that published tender overviews, like very special. These are our COVID. This is our COVID spending, which was Poland, which is Slovenia, Lithuania, and Portugal. And the rest of the Europe just did something. They published something, but not everything. And there were even countries who published completely nothing. And to this day, for example, the Netherlands published nothing at all. So this is to give kind of a heads up, like, this is the environment that you'll be working with if you're working with this data, and this is the environment that you're working in if you want to learn anything about this spending. So another piece of context that we got from the analysis was that the most of these tenders and contracts were awarded without competition. So if you see the blue dots, those were tenders which had some competition, and all the red dots these were direct awards. And on the website, this is an interactive graphic where you can hover over these dots and see how much it was. I think the biggest dots here were about €1 billion, which is a lot. After the context, we did some analysis. And one of the pieces of analysis we were focusing on were masks. So we found out that governments bought masks, FFP2 respirators to be concrete, that ranged from 20 cents to €37, which is crazy. And we also looked at drugs, which was a colleague of mine, Dada Lindell, that I worked with for this project. They found out that the numbers of contracts for certain drugs have increased 15-fold this year. Well, these were drugs were not really officially approved yet, but they were still bought by the government. So there was chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine. So this was a kind of a context that we saw, but they showed like this is 3 billion words of medical equipment that we found in these contracts, and you see that masks are like by far the biggest chunk of this money. And this is the spread of the prices that we published. So as you see on the very left, this is 20 cents. On the very right, this is nearly €40 for one piece of mask, and everything in between. So here, as a reader, you could see where was your country. So what basically you see that Italy, this is the fourth from the top. In Italy, they were buying a lot, but relatively early because they were impacted, was one of the first ones. So they bought relatively cheaply. But for countries who bought later, have a look at Czech or have a look at Slovakia or Slovenia, they were buying relatively early, so they got more prices. So there's a lot of analysis that could be done on this data. So, but this is, I mean, there's a lot of analysis. This was ours. There's obviously more possible. We also published the names of the suppliers, obviously. In this screenshot, I'm sorry, but they're kind of cut off. Not all of them are in these visualizations, but this is just to show you another piece of analysis that we did on this data. I think the part of democratizing data through data visualization, for example, is also to offer the reader the access to the analysis, to the knowledge that the data brings. It's not only the fact, that we did this fancy exercise of collecting all of this data, but we also need to tell the reader what are the possible interpretations of that. And this was the visualization on how many more of these tenders for these medicines were put up. So as you can see, the dexamethasone there was nearly no tenders for that in 2019, but in 2020 there were nearly 220. While again, this was a medicine that was never really approved for treating COVID. And the last part, so give the context, share your analysis, and I think a very important part is to share the data. So as I said, this is how we collected. We pulled the data from European Union's procurement portals, Tender Electronics Daily. We looked at national portals, regional governments, and bulk of the data came from Portugal, because Portugal has a very open system, and Russia. But I mean, we had something from every country. So this is a map that we published with the amounts summed up, and we had this exploratory table where you could basically put your country in, or put the product in, or filter between dates, filter on the description. And we have also published this as proper nerds on a GitHub repository, where we have exports, we have some script. To be honest, I doubt anybody ever used this, but it's out there to be used if anybody's interested. But I think it's, you never know, because sometimes in I think 80% of time nobody will, but in the 20% of time somebody will. So I think you ought to do this as a medium in the scope of democratizing data. Yeah, so this was it from me. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to all the questions.
Thank you so much, Ada. And now it's time for the session Ask Me Anything. Xaquín González Veira will discuss more in depth with Niko and Ada about their projects and professional experiences. Don't forget to write your questions here in the live chat. I'll be gather them and ask them to Xaquín, Ada, and Niko during this 30-minute conversation. So Xaquín, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Angela. Ada, I have a question for you. I know that you could talk about procurement data for hours, and I actually would love to just be on a session that's 4 or 5 hours long to know a lot more about this. But on your piece, you showed it right at the end here. But on your piece, you've got right at the beginning a map showing where your data comes from, and I would love to know more about who are the winners and losers in this transparency game. Which countries are doing the best efforts and releasing the data in the best ways possible?
Yes, thank you. So I think when it comes to procurement, if we really are to nerd out on this, the very best country is Ukraine. Ukraine has a system where you publish the tender, react on the tender, and publish the contract. This is one system, which is glorious, which is great. Actually, my colleagues from Ukraine have different problems than me. They have too much data, which sounds unbelievable to me. And yeah, so there's Ukraine. I think as I mentioned at the beginning, Lithuania is great. Poland was doing very well. Spain, Portugal, UK has even has an API for the procurement data. They have publications every day about what they spend. So those are the in my eyes, those are the winners. And the losers, actually, you wouldn't expect it, but Western European countries are really bad at this in general. I mean, I think UK is one of the exceptions here, because there is this larger culture of transparency, and you see this also in the US, in this English-speaking countries. But Netherlands has published nothing until this day. Denmark that didn't want to publish. Germany published very little. France published very little. So for me, those are the losers. When I moved to the Netherlands from Slovakia, and I wanted to do some stories on public tenders, and there were no data, and I was horrified. Like, how is this possible in the 21st century European Union and even Western country? So yeah.
Right. So what do you know the reason for that opacity in procurement data and the implications that can have? For example, in the Netherlands, why is the government saying that we can't release that data?
So the government says, government says a very interesting thing. So maybe, I don't know if you know that, but the government in the Netherlands for the longest time was right liberal. And that means that they are very cozy with companies. And so what we hear from the government, not even from the companies, but from the government, they say like, yeah, the companies would not like it if we publish because it's company sensitive information, and they don't want to anger, or they don't want to stir any conflicts with the companies by publishing the data. Although you also hear from the companies that actually in general they would not mind that. They actually, for the companies themselves, it's an interesting look into how other companies do their business. So if there's a tender published for something and then you see that the winning prize was this, and then you think, oh, maybe I can do this for this too, or you can do this for this too, and then it can actually spur innovation in the market. But the Dutch government really holds this line for the longest time, and there is maybe something about to change. I don't know. I'm really careful about that. But the Dutch government now got some money from the European Union to do some more transparency. But to be honest, I'm a bit pessimistic about that because the culture is very strong.
So basically, what this opacity does is it obstructs any sort of accountability efforts, right?
Indeed, and as I said, the Dutch government, what they did with the COVID spending is that they moved it from the government responsibilities to a different vehicle, and that is not foyable. So you can't. It's a construction where you can't really ask for open data to ask them to publish the contracts. And as I don't know, Niko, you probably know that during the pandemics there were lots of publications in the UK about the pandemic. This pandemic contract was given to this politician, to this friend of that politician, and so forth. In the Netherlands, we had our first story on this last month. And nothing else. And I think everywhere where this data was open, everywhere were stories about nepotism, about too big, prizes and so forth. So I think it's actually a big loss for the government, because if you publish this data, maybe in the future you can actually save some money.
And I don't know if anyone from the audience, it's probably the question in everyone's mind right now. When you see stories of this scope, so massive in terms of data research, of the presentation and everything, how long did it take to put this together, and what was the size of the team involved?
So with this COVID procurement research, I was doing the data collection, data standardization, and the data analysis, and actually writing the piece as well. And it took me, it took me 6 months. And then my colleague, as I mentioned, Ada Lindell, they did the part on medicines. That was a bit shorter, but that was only TED data. And I got help from local journalists in the sense that they sent me where the data is, and sometimes they act for us. And then there was a developer. I see that there's a question in the comments. He developed the map. He was a JavaScript developer, and we used Flourish for the rest, and an editor. So I think we were effectively a team of 4, with me doing the most work, and some support with the journalists. And it took me 6 months.
Okay, I think there are some questions from the audience for Ada. Angela, do you want to jump in with some of those questions? We can continue with Niko, because I actually want to ask him something about a couple of the projects. just full disclosure, Niko and I worked together at the Guardian a few years ago.
Many years ago.
Don't say many years ago. Don't reveal age.
Ask away.
A couple of things that I love about the work that you do at the Guardian and your style is that readers don't need to when you see one of your visualizations, the reader won't wonder about the methodology. They just get the communication, the data communication that you're trying to do. Can you tell us a little bit more about, like, how do you simplify things to a point that that you distill the essence of the message in visuals and words?
And I think that's a great point, and it's one of the key challenges of most of the stories I do and most of the interactive graphics I do. I think it's not fundamentally that different from any other type of journalistic story. I think if you have small technical details or things that kind of qualify the headline findings of your article, you wouldn't put those in the first or the second paragraph. You certainly wouldn't put them in the headline. But you do hint at them early on and then put them somewhere further down where people who are interested can follow up. And I think that's basically what I'm trying to do with these graphics. So the housing affordability map, I think, was the best example of that. There are just way too many assumptions that go into it to list them all on top of the graphic or in the graphic in some way. I think you have to accept, and readers have to accept, that they are going to get the headline finding first, and then they have to keep reading if they want to know what the underlying assumptions were. And in this case, there were so many assumptions. You know, the age of the house buyer, do they have a partner, do they have children, do they have a student loan, all kinds of things like that would influence whether the bank would give you a mortgage, i.e. a loan to buy the house. And by abstracting that all away, we can deliver this really strong message first, which is 90%, 95% of the country is unaffordable for a certain profession, say the care worker. And then you keep reading to see, well, are these assumptions plausible or do they maybe not apply to everyone? If that makes sense.
I think so. And there's another very interesting, because this is obviously a balance. This is something we will struggle to do. It's that you still think, or at least I can tell in your visuals, that you don't shy away from complexity, right? The first visual that you showed, it's not easy to, you need to read, right? So how do you feel about when people talk about information graphics as at a glance communication products? It drives me nuts because they don't need to be at a glance. They're things that you need to read, right?
Yeah, I think that's the other side of that same coin, the same trade-off. You, as you say, in some graphics, there is one point that I want you to be able to see immediately within the first, 3-4 seconds that you look at it. But some graphics don't have that. They do require you invest the time and you take the time to read. And this is where it gets difficult. I think then the challenge is about making the initial tease so strong that people have an incentive to keep reading. So the example I showed first with the flow of people going through the test and trace system, I think it's precisely that movement and this kind of exciting looking graphic of people spreading out into the open that people look at and they go, oh, this looks interesting. Well, let me read the text next to it. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's interesting motion and color going on, and it's an extra incentive for people to read the story. And if we didn't have that, we could still do the story, but it would be a lot of very dry numbers, right? We could still say, oh, in the first stage, 85% of people are successfully called. In the next stage, 80% of contacts are successfully reached. But no one would want to read that without this flow and interesting graphic, I assume.
Right. I think we have a lot of questions from the audience, so we're going to take some.
Yes, we have. We can start with Jonathan Ukbal. Jonathan asked that in Cross River, Nigeria, nothing has been published about what was done with the billions of naira received in willing donations and funds removed from local government accounts by the state government. And he asks, dear Adriana, dear Xaquín, Niko, and Ada, I guess, what tools can be used to develop this great visual data, such as the map?
I think Niko is the specialist here.
That is a good question. A lot of the maps we develop are made in D3.js, so that's a JavaScript library. So I'm not just an editor and writer, but also a developer. But there are other tools available that make this process a lot easier if you don't have a coding background, like Data Wrapper or Flourish come to mind. Maybe Ada and Xaquín have also got recommendations to share.
Ada, I think we use Flourish, right?
Yeah, we used Flourish in our publications. And if you, Jonathan, if you are a newsroom, you get free access to Flourish. I don't know if you know Flourish. I don't have access to the chat. I'm sorry, but I don't. I can't write. Yeah, it's a flourish.studio, and I prefer Flourish because it's really made for journalists, with journalists in mind. While, as Sharon says, you can use Tableau. Tableau is, I think, more meant for dashboards, and it's not super. I mean, what is important? I don't know about where you are, Jonathan, in Nigeria, but here in Europe, many people access media through their phones. And there it's very important that your visuals work on a phone as well. I found Tableau very enraging in that terms. So yeah, give Flourish a chance. I think it's a good one. Otherwise, Data Wrapper is very good. Datawrapper.de. For if you don't want to learn coding. If you want to learn coding, just do some D3 and JavaScript.
There's also what is your audience? What is the reason you're doing this discovering or uncovering of the data? If you're a news organization, as like Niko, Ada, and I are assuming, or if you're an activist organization that just want to like release the data, you could do it through Tableau because you're assuming that somebody else is going to do the work of contextualizing that data. That also is key to your choosing of the tools, Jonathan.
We have another question from Ivan Bashkirov. Ivan asks, could you talk a bit about connecting to the reader and what channels you found most effective? Once a story is done, what were some of the good ways to get people interested and get the story seen? Who answers first?
I can answer that briefly, and then we can. That's a really good question, and one that it's actually quite hard, I think, to get this right. So one of the first avenues for me to share stories is on social media, and specifically on Twitter. But the huge drawback of that is that you are talking to a bubble of people that are just not representative of the wider audience. So certainly on my Twitter timeline, and probably on most other journalists, the people you encounter that you see your postings are going to be closer to the media bubble themselves, possibly they will have a higher kind of baseline interest in politics and other areas of journalism, and their reactions just won't be representative of how the average person in the street is going to react to your article. So that can be a huge kind of pitfall. You know, if you think, oh, this is getting good reaction on Twitter, people are really interested in this, that can be a bit misleading. One thing that we have at The Guardian that's great is we have a community team who will help us with reaching out to readers. So they will just upload an article essentially that says, have you worked in the test and trace system in England? Or have you had COVID and gone through the test and trace system? Please reply here with this form. And then they can share the readers' responses with other teams. And that is exactly what we did on this test and trace story, actually. So I got to read through readers' experiences of going through the system, and it was quite shocking, actually. So that's probably a better way than the social media avenue, I feel, but obviously it's not something that every newsroom can afford to do.
Right. I was gonna say cue the community team, because we there are specialists that look into this. Probably Ada can answer more about how they did it for their project, because I trust the experts on every aspect of the cycle of communication, and I happen not to be an expert in community.
I happen not to even be expert in people. That's why I do data journalism. But I think that's a great question, and to add to the audience, what I actually who I wanted to reach out as well were public procurement nerds, you know, because this is this is a story about, you know, public spending. It's actually very abstract for a general audience often, because we were talking about millions and billions, and you know, you can't really imagine how much money that is and how does that affect you. So I think that's also sometimes maybe you want to reach a community of experts rather than a general audience. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for, you know, informing the public, and I think the article is also written in a way that everybody can understand what's happening. But as I showed in my presentation, for example, I published the GitHub repository that is clearly not for my mom to engage with. So yeah, you can play around with your audience as well.
We have another question from Amol Singla. Amol asks, what % of the work is coding and what % is proper research? And as a novice who knows nothing about coding, how fast can one catch up?
What do you mean proper research? I think coding is a part of the proper research, right? Like if you do data analysis in code, that's your research. You know, if you are looking through the annual reports of a company and you can put it in a table and you can run analysis on that, that's your research, right? So yeah. I
think that their question may have been in the I don't know exactly what the context of like what they call coding is, but there's a, it's usually for data projects like data-driven projects like this that have some strong visual storytelling component. We always say that it's 80% is data cleaning and data analysis, and about like 20% is actual presentation, is the 80-20 rule, and I think that still holds true. But what you were saying, like most of the data analysis that we do now is we do it in code. And in terms of how long does it take to catch up with whom? Because I've been like doing this for 20 years, and I am not even close to catching up with some of my colleagues. But in 2 years, you can be, or in a year, you can be analyzing data through code and visualizing data. It doesn't take that much. What takes time is getting into the right mindset and have enough patience to crash against the wall over and over and over again to get things to work or to clean data sets. How about you, Niko? You're a rare bird. You do like really impressive data analysis and visualization with coding.
So the original question, how I split the time, that depends completely on the project, obviously. I think where Xaquín makes a really good point is that it's maybe not so much your technical skills in and of itself, the coding itself, that the level of coding skill that determines where you're going with your story. And the important part is to look at the data and get a feel for what's possible with it. And this is also a quality that me and my colleagues, really appreciate in other desks and other desk editors at The Guardian. So if someone comes to us and just says, oh, we're doing a story on XYZ, can you please get some interesting data? That's a useless request, because they don't know what's available. They don't know what's possible with the data. We have to start from zero. Maybe we don't know the area as well as they do, and have to try different things in our analysis before we can settle on a narrative. If you come to us and you have a very specific idea already, you can say, oh, this website publishes this information every day. Would it be possible to store the data every day and then chart where it's gone over time? That is a request we can work with much better. And that person doesn't need to be able to do that coding work, or specifically the scraping work, that's what that's called. They need to be able to do that themselves, but they need to be able to formulate what they want from us in a sort of structured way. And they need to have at least a broad understanding of what data is available and what can be done with it. And then you hand that off to the best coder you have on your team, or the person that's most experienced with this particular type of analysis. And that's how we approach it.
We have sorry, yes, go ahead, Xaquín. Or Adam, yes.
If I can add to also, Anmol says that I meant as a person who is absolutely scared of coding and computers. Well, that's not a good start. I mean, I like to use the paraphrase of playing the guitar. It's like you say, I love to play the guitar, but I'm absolutely scared to touch one. You just need to go over it and just try, right? And then as well as with playing an instrument, I mean, there are instruments that are easier, there are instruments that are more difficult, there are instruments that are forgiving, there are instruments that are less forgiving, but the practice is the key. You just need to go. You just need to go for it. And I mean, you'll fail probably, and you'll fail a lot. And with coding as well, with any actually complex skill, is like the first couple of months you'll be like here. Sorry, I don't think you can see it, but you'll be like here. And then you come to a point where you start going up, and when you start going up, it's going to get up very easily. So, you know, a lot more easily. So at first it's frustrating, it's a long process, but, you know, just I think the first step is, you know, just go for it. Don't be scared.
Xaquín, you would like to add something?
No, it was exactly the same thoughts that Ada wanted to share.
We have time for 2 more questions. One is coming from Sebastian. Sebastian says that Germans are more hesitant to share data, and privacy laws here are quite strict. Can you describe for us how you overcome the challenges presented by privacy laws when working as a data journalist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I know that Germany is very peculiar in this, actually, also within Europe. But also with the GDPR, you as a journalist, you actually have a public interest clause. And within this public interest clause, you can do more than you ever imagined. No, you can do more than just a company or whatever who does this commercially. So I think the strategy is to say, you know, I'm a journalist, I have public interest at mind, this is data I want, this is information I want, and just to push with this, and you know, you get as far as you get.
I think, Niko, in the UK, there are similar issues with privacy. That unless there's it's not just saying that you've got a public in mind in whatever you're trying to do. You really need to state what is your intent with the data before even before even opening a file that may contain sensitive information. I had that experience at the Guardian. If you want to tell a little bit more about the UK case, which is, I think it applies, the experience of how you unlock that in the UK applies to Germany as well, I believe.
So I haven't had too many projects myself where this became a big factor, but yeah, I think it's definitely possible that you try to get some data from a government department, and they tell you, no, we have to suppress this information because you would be able to identify individuals from the data set. And I think what's key there is to, as Xaquín just said, figure out for yourself what the story, and in my case, the visuals are going to say. And I guess what the minimum amount of data is then to realize that. And then you can go back to that government body and say, look, what we're trying to do is this. The question we're trying to answer is this. Can you give us a summary of the data that doesn't reveal anyone's individual information, that still answers that question? So one example I could think of was a story I did 2 years ago on people in the UK who take the most international flights. So this was an environment story. And without revealing anyone's individual flight pattern, I just asked for a breakdown. Well, what share of all flights is taken by the 1% most frequent flyers? And what share of flights is taken by the 10% most frequent flyers? And then you get a great headline without ever looking at anyone's individual information. So that has worked well for us.
We have one last question. Xaquín, you would like to add something else? Yeah, please go ahead.
Just wondering if that answers Sebastian's question, because we weren't specific about Germany. Sorry.
Sebastian will come now in a few minutes, so he will tell you. I mean, you reply to his question. We have time just for one question, and it is from Narisa. Narisa asks, what kind of training in data journalism can you recommend for traditional journalists looking to upgrade their skills?
Yeah, I mean, depends where you are. And I mean, do you speak good English? Because there is plenty of courses online, and depends what you want to learn. So it really, there's so much out there. If I would first find a project you would like to do, and then figure out what do you need to learn in order to achieve that. Because if you, for example, people often want to learn coding, but they don't really understand what data analysis is yet. So if you do have a decent Excel skills, then I would recommend you start coding. For example, if you want to do for analysis, for visualizations, actually as well, because it's a similar skill set. So I think, you know, if you do not have that yet, start with Excel, do some tables, do some averages, do some sorting, do some filtering, and then once you know what's possible, coding is more of a efficiency thing than you can do things with tools that you can do with coding. Only with coding it's faster. Now, in order to learn what to do with coding, you need to probably first start to learn the tools that are out there that are more like click based, to learn the concepts, and then you can go to coding. I'm not sure whether this is super helpful, but yeah, I think that, that's how I started too.
I can sell our master's program that we organized with the University of Girona from the foundation. It's an online master's, but it is and it's thought of to supplement what other masters in data journalism are doing, other programs in data journalism are doing. Ours is not specifically on data journalism. It's about creating visual tools to empower citizens. So it's very code heavy, but we do touch on. So if you're a traditional journalist, you already have that editorial mindset. We have this master's program at the University of Girona that is basically teaching you how to do those things with code, as Ada was saying. And it's project based, and it's online, and it's in English. That's one way of starting. It's intensive, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I also, my answer would be along the lines of what Ada said. I think my number one piece of advice would be to pick one particular project that you think can be enriched with data, or actually you think it needs data at its very core, or you have a particular visual in mind that you want to create, and then you try and find out what the tools are that you would need. Otherwise, if you are just starting out in the industry as a young journalist, I would recommend doing coding classes because it's only going to get more important. And if you have the time and money, then yes, doing a master's or a degree in data journalism can be very rewarding. I did my master's in data journalism at Cardiff University in Wales. And there are now more and more such programs in Europe. So it is a great option.
No, I mean, we're done. And thank you so much, Niko, Xaquín, Ada, for this great talk and for your presentations before. And thank you so much for opening Democratizing Data, the first News Impact Summit of the year. Really, thank you so much.